Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final lecture for Political Science 110, Government of the United States. I know it has been a lot of videos that you have been required to watch. I know I'm assuming at least, that you're probably tired of watching these videos. I know I'm a little tired of recording the videos. Chapter 15 is a pretty quick lecture, so hopefully we won't be on here for too long, but I do appreciate you hanging in there this semester and watching all of the videos. So far, we have covered a ton of material about our government of the United States. We've looked at the different institutional structures. We've looked at the different influences and different organizations that are influencing our government. We've looked at how the government runs, and we've looked at the impact that we as citizens can have on our government as well. So we talked about how Congress makes our laws, the legislative branch. The judicial branch is our courts, and they decide whether or not our laws and the actions of our government are constitutional or unconstitutional. And then we talked about the executive branch and how their job is to enforce the laws that are coming out of Congress. Today, we're going to talk about the bureaucracy. Get over there. The bureaucracy basically are the part of the executive branch, and they are the ones in charge of carrying out the president's duties. So when a law is passed, it gets sent to the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy is then the one that implements it and actually puts it into action. So when we look at a bureaucracy, the book defines a bureaucracy as an administrative group of non-elected officials charged with carrying out functions connected to a series of policies and programs. What this means is that these are individuals that are working under the executive branch, working under our president. They aren't elected, they are hired by the bureaucracy, and their job is to actually carry out those laws that Congress has passed or the policies that the president wants to put into place. As they are doing this, they've got three goals. Their goals are to provide goods to us citizens, to enhance our quality of life, and to stimulate economic growth so that our country continues to be prosperous. You'll hear a lot of times the word bureaucrat being thrown around. When you hear the word bureaucrat, what they're referring to is simply an employee of the bureaucracy. So if you hear a bureaucrat, that is someone that works for the federal government under the executive branch, and they're the ones that are carrying out the actual laws and policies. There's lots of concern about the size of the governmental bureaucracy simply because it has continued to grow as time has passed. The chart that we've got right here goes from 2010 to 2022, and it shows you how many employees are part of the government. The blue line is our federal government employees, and the black line are our state government employees. So if we look at 2022, the most recent year here on this chart, we see we've got 2.87 million federal government employees on payroll, and we've got 19.23 million state government employees on payroll. All totaled, that puts us right at 23 million people on payroll. Now, the reason why the state government payroll is such higher than the federal government is because that's distributed among the 50 states. So if we break that down by state, we're looking at less than 500,000 people per state on on the state government payroll versus 2.87 million on the federal government payroll. These numbers have stayed pretty consistent over the past 20 years, so we've been hovering right around 23 million 23 million governmental employees total. On the federal government level, we're looking at about $12 billion of our budget. And that budget comes out of the discretionary budget, and the salaries and benefits make up about 45% of the discretionary budget of Congress. For it, so what we're looking at, about $12 billion is being spent on those 2.87 million people, on their salaries, on their benefits, their health care, their pensions, those sorts of things. But the size of the federal bureaucracy is quite large when we compare it to the state bureaucracies. So originally, we had a system in place called patronage. And patronage was essentially where the president that won the election would get to choose who he wanted or did not want to fill the roles of the bureaucracy. That's better. So he would go through and he would basically pick his friends, he would pick his family members, or he would pick party loyalists, people that helped him get elected, people that were loyal to his political party, and they would get these prime positions within the bureaucracy. Now, the idea behind patronage is that it allows the government to run smoothly. If the president is able to handpick those that are in charge of the bureaucracy and the employees within the bureaucracy, then he's able to ensure that the people he's putting into positions of power views align with his, their policies align with his. And if everyone agrees on what should happen and how it should happen, then everything will run more smoothly because there'll be less conflict. So this was referred to in the New York Senator William Macy as to the victor go the spoils. So the victor is the winner of the election, obviously the president, and the spoils is the ability to give prime jobs to their party loyalists, to their friends, their family. Now we have two different types of patronage that don't involve necessarily party loyalists, and that is what we call cronyism and nepotism. So cronyism is when you give a job to your friend. Nepotism is when you give a job to a family member. Now the problem with patronage is that just because this person is a party loyalist or a friend or a family member, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be the most qualified person for the position. And more often than not, with the patronage system, what we saw was a president was appointing people that he wanted in the positions, but those people were not the most qualified, not the most educated, not the most experienced in the job. So that idea of efficiency, because they're going to do exactly what the president wants, kind of doesn't balance out when you take into consideration the person in charge may not know what they're doing or how to do it. So that's going to slow the process down. That's going to create lots of opportunities for mistakes to happen within the bureaucracy. Now, the bureaucracy continued on, and then in 1881, it came to a head with the assassination of President James Garfield. What had happened was there a gentleman named Charles Guiteau. He was an attorney and a businessman. He had several failed businesses. He wasn't very successful in his ventures, and he had some mental health issues. And his family was actually so concerned about him that they tried to have him committed to a mental institution. Their efforts failed, and Mr. Guiteau, during the election, originally backed Garfield's competitor, Ulysses S. Grant, for the primary. So in the primary election, Mr. Guiteau wanted Ulysses S. Grant to receive the party's nomination for president. He lost, but in the process, he had written this glowing speech for Ulysses S. Grant where he talked about how qualified Ulysses S. Grant was. And he cited to several examples of things that Grant had done to make our country better, to show how he was more qualified. When Grant lost the primary election, Mr. Guiteau then took that same speech and modified it for James Garfield. But he didn't do a very good job of modifying it because all of those accomplishments that he had, recognized that Grant had done, he simply switched it up and now claimed that Garfield had made those accomplishments. So he wrote the speech. He never actually gave it in person. He did print it and distribute it out. So his speech was out there in the public for them to read. And then James Garfield won the election. So once Garfield won the election, Mr. Guiteau believed that under the patronage system, he was entitled to a job. And he didn't just want any job, he wanted a diplomatic post in either Vienna or Paris. So he went to President Garfield and said, hey, I was one of your key supporters. I'm the reason you got elected. You owe me a job. These are the jobs that I want. And President Garfield declined to give him those jobs. So at this point in time, Mr. Guiteau had been living in hotels in Washington, D.C., and he didn't have a lot of money left. So he wasn't able to pay his bills at the hotel. So what he was doing is he was kind of he would go to a hotel. When the bill would come, he would leave without paying. He would go to another hotel until he basically had hit all the hotels in DC and there was nowhere else for him to stay. During that time period, he continued to come back to the White House and try and gain an audience with President Garfield and with his cabinet to get them to give him this post. It got so bad that at one point, had essentially was homeless at this point, was pretty disheveled. And basically the White House staff had to tell him that he had to stop coming, that he couldn't just come and hang out there every day, that he wasn't going to get this job. So after this happened, Mr. Guiteau believed that the Lord spoke to him and that the Lord told him that he should kill the president. So on July 2nd, 1881, he went to a public place where he knew that the president would be, and he shot him 2 times in the back. Now, President Garfield didn't die on July 2nd. He actually died 79 days later. And what he died from was not necessarily the gunshot itself, but an infection from that gunshot. Now, back in the late 1800s, we didn't have all the medical advances we had today, like x-rays and penicillin, and they didn't know to, sterilize tools and those sorts of things. So what happened was that when the doctor came, President Garfield told him, I believe the gun, the bullet came in through this side of my back, and this is where I believe it's at. Well, he was wrong. He gave him the wrong side. And so the doctor basically sort of fished around in President Garfield's back, trying to find that bullet. And in doing so, gave him an infection. And that infection is what ultimately took out President Garfield about 4 months later. All right. So, in response to James Guteau and his demand for a prime position within the bureaucracy, Congress enacted the Pendleton Act, or what we call the Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. Now, this was established with an attempt to remove the problems with patronage, to take away the issue of not having the most qualified person take on these positions. They wanted to eliminate things like nepotism and cronyism and party loyalties. And they didn't want to have a situation ever again where an individual felt like they were owed a position within the bureaucracy and that would come to violence. So the Pendleton Act did several things. It mandated that positions within the federal government be awarded on the basis of merit as opposed to patronage. To make sure that this happened, they established the Civil Service Commission, and their job was to make sure that selection, retention, and promotion practices were based upon competitive examinations. So it wasn't just you got hired and your boss really likes you a lot, and so you're going to get raises and you're going to advance up. There were examinations that individuals had to take to prove that they were the most qualified for that position or that they qualified for a promotion. They made it illegal to fire or demote someone based upon political reasons. So just because you weren't a member of the president's political party didn't mean that they could eliminate you or reduce your duties within the bureaucracy. What we saw was that the Pendleton Act originally only applied to about 10% of the federal bureaucracy, but now that as time has passed, it's been expanded to cover most of the federal bureaucracy. One of the other things that the Pendleton Act did was it changed how campaign financing happened. Prior to the Pendleton Act, what would happen in the bureaucracy is the managers and those in charge of the bureaucracy would go to their employees and say, hey, this president's up for election or up for re-election, and we need your support. So we need you to pledge that you're going to vote for the president for re-election. We need you to contribute to the campaign with donations and those sorts of things. Now, since they were no longer allowed to do that under the Pendleton Act, we saw our elected officials then turn to other private sources for campaign funding and those sorts of things. The Pendleton Act in October 2020, President Trump signed an executive order trying to exempt policy-making positions from the Pendleton Act so that he could bring in advisors, people to give him advice that weren't necessarily going through the Civil Service Commission, that he could appoint based upon patronage or nepotism or cronyism. He basically, goal there was to try and do away with due process and collective bargaining rights for these individuals in these policy positions, which would have allowed him not only to hire people that he wanted, but also to fire at will without a legitimate reason. When President Biden took office in January 2021, he rescinded President Trump's order. So the Pendleton Act is back in place in full for the federal bureaucracy. Now, lecture review question number 1. What did the Pendleton Act do? What are the 3 things that we just talked about? Okay, so if we go on to see what one of the other things that the Pendleton Act did was it created the civil service and pay practices. So now what we see is individuals were required to take what we call a PACE exam. It's a professional administrative career examination. And based upon how they did on that examination, it would determine what jobs within the bureaucracy they qualified, what level they came in on grade, which meant it impacted what their salary was going to be. Now, salaries, as you see here, are set by the general schedule. And so the reason for this is so that everyone within the bureaucracy can anticipate exactly how much they're supposed to make and how to advance on the pay scale itself. So grade means, how many years you've served, and step means what skills you have. So as you max out in terms of years within the bureaucracy and skills, you can make up to a total amount of $152,000 a year. Starting off grade 1, step 1 is a little under $21,000 a year, basically. So employees are able to anticipate what they need to do to increase their salaries. It takes the discretion away from the managers so that a manager can't then turn around to someone and say, we're going to pay you better, or we're going to pay you less, or increase your salary because we like you or because you're one of our favorites. Now, in 1981, there was a study that was done that looked at those PACE examinations. And what they saw was that African American and Latino test takers scored lower on those tests than everyone else. And because they scored lower on those tests, they either then weren't eligible for the jobs or they started in at a lower grade and a lower step than everyone else. So a group sued the U.S. government, claiming that these exams were discriminatory against them. And the U.S. government in 81 settled that discrimination suit after looking at the studies and realizing that, yes, these results were skewed. So now instead of the PACE exams, what the federal government looks at is they look at the education, the background, the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities of the individual to determine what step they're going to enter at and what they're qualified to do. We see some of the civil service exams are still being used in scenarios where critical thinking or very technical skills are required, just to make sure that the individual applying for that position has those particular skills. If we look at this pay scale, in October of 2023, they went through and looked at the average salary of an employee in the federal government. And the average salary is about $83,000 a year, which, if you break that down, came out to about $40 an hour for the average employee within the bureaucracy. Now, when we look at the bureaucracy, the textbook talks briefly about three different models. And I think it's important to take a look at these models because a lot of times it will help us understand how the bureaucracy actually functions, and it'll open our eyes to different things maybe we didn't think about. So we're going to go through the three models really quickly. The Weberian model. Now, this is a classic model of bureaucracy. And here the belief is that agencies are apolitical, they're hierarchical, they're organized, and they are governed by formal procedures. Now, because they are organized and governed by formal procedures, the employees within the bureaucracy know exactly what to do when they come to work. They know the procedures are supposed to follow. If there's a problem, there's a chain of command that they can go to resolve that problem. The belief under the Bureacracy model is that we've got these specialized bureaucracies that deal with one issue and one issue or one area only. And because they're specialized, they're better able to handle those issues and better able to use logic to solve those problems. It stops problematic decision making by removing discretion and removing the individuals that don't really know what they're doing from those positions. And because there's very little discretion happening in the decision making process, and everyone knows what to expect, and there's accountability, the Weberian model believes that our government, or bureaucracy specifically, runs more smoothly. The second one is we have the acquisitive model. And under this one, the belief is that our bureaucracies are money hungry and they are competitive. That they look at our government as a whole and they believe that our government has limited resources. When the budget is being done, there's only so much money that can be allocated to each individual bureaucratic agency. So the belief there is that they will use all their resources that Congress gives them every single year so that they can come back and try and ask for more money from Congress itself. And in asking for more money, they're doing that to the detriment of the other bureaucracies. Because if there's only so much money in Congress to be spent on the bureaucracies, if they are asking for more money, that means that another bureaucratic agency will receive less money. So at the end of the year, when they're looking at their budget and they realize that they have a surplus of money, maybe there's $1 million that they didn't spend, they'll find a way to spend that $1 million. So they can go back to Congress and say, look, you gave us, $10 million. We spent $10 million. We need more money. And the bureaucracy continues to grow and grow and grow as the funding increases. All right. The last one, finally, is a monopolistic model. And here they look at the bureaucracy and the fact that each bureaucratic agency is specialized, right? We have the IRS that does taxes. We've got Department of Homeland Security that handles immigration. Because each agency is specialized and they're the only ones providing that particular service, there's no competition. There's no need, if there's no competition, there's no need for the bureaucracies to become more efficient, to provide better customer service, because they are the only ones that we go to. Think about every year when you file your federal income taxes with the government. You can only file that using the form the IRS gives you with the IRS themselves. You can't take that form and go to Department of Homeland Security and say, hey, I want to file my taxes with you, or Department of Education, we want to file my taxes with you because I think the IRS sucks. They're going to tell you, no, you can't do that. That has to go to the IRS. So since there's nowhere else you can go, then the IRS, there's no incentive for them to become more efficient, to give you better customer service, to keep the public happy as a whole. So this lack of competition leads to excessive waste, and it leads to bad customer service within the bureaucracy. All right. So within the bureaucracy, we see that there are different types of agencies or departments within federal bureaucracies. We have our cabinet departments, which we talked about when we talked about the executive branch. We've got the independent executive agencies and regulatory agencies. We talked about them a little bit when we talked about the executive branch. And then we also have government corporations. So if we start with the cabinet departments, these are the ones, the secretaries that report directly to the president. So we talked about, the Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, Health and Human Services, Department of the Treasury. They all report directly to the president. And so they are in charge of these different areas. Obviously, education is education, Veterans Affairs, veterans, so on and so forth. Below them, we have the independent executive agencies and regulatory agencies, and they report directly to the president also, but they are assigned far more focused tasks. So instead of it being general, like the Department of Homeland Security covers all of immigration and our borders, they're going to be assigned things like processing immigration applications or protecting our borders or those sorts of things. And then finally, we have government corporations. Now, government corporations are corporations just like private corporations, but they are owned by the federal government. Now, what the federal government has done is they've created these corporations because they're essentially the equivalent of private businesses. But these services that these corporations are providing are so important that our federal government has decided that we cannot let them fail. For example, the U.S. Postal Service. If we were to allow the U.S. Postal Service to privatize, then we would run the risk that at some point, maybe the Postal Service wouldn't be generating a profit, which it's really not now for the federal government. It's not going to generate a profit. And if it's not generating a profit, then the businesses will eventually go bankrupt and close, and we won't have access to the Postal Service. The government has realized that the Postal Service is a necessary tool used by all citizens. Now, the internet and, Apple Pay and bill pay and those sorts of things, the Postal Service isn't being used as much as it was 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. But before previously, if I had a bill to pay, I would either have to go to the location of the bill, go to the gas company and pay it directly with the gas company, or I would use the Postal Service to mail that bill into them. The Postal Service was also how the gas company would mail me my bill so I know how much I owe them every month. It also allowed citizens across the United States to maintain meaningful contacts with their family members. Transportation was very slow and not very cost effective, and telephones were, but I'm going to age myself even more. But, when I was, in college and even when I was in law school, long distance phone calls cost money. We didn't have cell phones like we have now, where you can call anywhere across the United States. If you're going to call out of state, you're paying an additional premium fee for calling that person. So the Postal Service, with a set price of a stamp, you could correspond and keep in touch with relatives across the country at a very low cost. So these government and corporations, again, are so important that the government has decided that we can't allow these different services to fail. So U.S. Postal Service is a government corporation, Amtrak, which is the railways that transport people back and forth across our country. It's another government corporation. Again, the cost of travel is really expensive. Even now, it's very expensive. And so Amtrak provides an affordable way for individuals to move across the country. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are loan programs for first-time home buyers to allow citizens in the United States to be able to purchase homes with an affordable mortgage that maybe otherwise wouldn't qualify for a mortgage. All right, let's review question number 2. Why do we have these government corporations? Okay, so now we've talked about the government corporations, we've talked about the agencies. Let's talk for a second about how the agencies actually do their work. So, how it works, remember, Congress passes this law, it goes to the president, and the president signs this law, and then the president passes it down to the bureaucracy. Now, the bureaucracy gets this law, but a lot of times these laws aren't very detailed, right? It might say, we're going to provide, let's take DACA, for example, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DREAMers. Congress said, or actually, Congress didn't say, the president said, we're going to implement this DACA plan to help our children, help the children that are here in the US that for no reason, for no fault of their own. So the president said, we're going to implement this plan and we're going to apply it to children that have, have been here from a certain date and have this level of education. And then they pass it down to the Department of Homeland Security. And what the Department of Homeland Security does, the bureaucracies then decide how we're going to implement that. What form are we going to use? What information is going to be on that form? Are we going to require a filing fee? When that form is completed, where are we sending that form? What are the procedures that the adjudicators, once they receive that form, what are the boxes they need to check off to decide whether or not they're going to approve it? Once they've approved it, how do we notify that individual? What benefits do they receive, et cetera, et cetera? So they get a very basic order from the president or a very basic law, and then their job is to actually implement that. So how that happens is what we call negotiated rulemaking. So under negotiated rulemaking, they get together conveners to create a committee. And these conveners are generally individuals who have a vested interest in the proposed rules. So on that council are going to be members of the bureaucracy, obviously, because they're going to be the ones implementing it. If for the DACA, for example, we're probably going to have immigration advocates on that panel, on that committee, because they know what the needs of the immigrant community are. They know how easy certain documents are to access. So if we're going to require 20 documents, they can say, look, these documents are easily accessible. These they won't be able to get. And there's probably also going to be some individuals on that committee that are opposed to the DACA program. They want to make sure that it's narrowly tailored and strictly enforced so that people that aren't eligible extra people aren't being included under the program. So the conveners and neutral advisors create the committee of all these individuals, and then they set the procedures for reaching a consensus. How many people on this committee do we need to have agree in order for this to be the rule to be able to be enforced? So the committee gets together, they discuss the pros and cons of the different proposals on how to enact this piece of legislation or the policy, and then they reach a consensus. Once they reach that consensus, it's that the rule is then published in the Code of Federal Regulations, and we, the public, and other agencies organizations in the country have an opportunity to read those federal regulations and then also to comment on them. So there's a comment period where they open it up, where they say, hey, what do you think about this? And then we're able to say, well, that's a good idea, that's a bad idea, this is going to be problematic, or the fees are too high, or the processing times, or what have you. Once they get back the comments on the federal regulations, they'll go through, review those comments, make modifications as needed, and then they will implement the final rule itself. Okay, so we've got the bureaucracy, and we know that the bureaucracy, across the country, we're looking at 23 million. Within the federal government, we're looking at just under 3 million people within the federal bureaucracy. But how do we check them? How do we make sure that they are doing their job? How do we make sure that there's not excessive waste, that there's not bad customer service, those sorts of things? So within our structure of our government, there are several different ways that we have to check our bureaucracy and make sure that it runs smoothly. We've got, the Government Accountability Office, what they call the GAO. There's presidential appointments. The president can appoint people to make sure the bureaucracies are running smoothly. We have the Office of Management and Budget, the Freedom of Information Act of 1996, and the Government Sunshine Act. So let's start with Congress's checks on the bureaucracy. So Congress has the power to do oversight on the federal bureaucracy, meaning they're allowed to go in and look at the agency records, to review their books, to review their employment practices, to review how things are happening, to make sure that the money being allocated by Congress is being spent the way that it was intended to be spent, and also to make sure that there isn't excessive waste, that there isn't ways where we can cut the size of the bureaucracy, or that the bureaucracy isn't doing what it's not supposed to be doing. So we do this through the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO. It's also known as the bureaucratic watch, or the congressional watchdog, and it's the Congress's most powerful oversight tool. So they go through, they audit, they evaluate, and they investigate the different bureaucracies. They're supposed to operate in a nonpartisan fact-based manner. So they're not supposed to come in with the views of a Democrat or the views of a Republican to try and, attack the bureaucracy to do what their political party wants. It's supposed to be very, very neutral. If we look at the GAO itself and how it operates, in 2022, the GAO was allocated a budget of $794 million to do their job of oversight. What we saw, though, the results of the GAO inquiries and investigations, the results were that we got over $55 billion in financial benefits from that investment of $794 million that we put in, which means that the return basically was for every dollar that we spent on the GAO, we saved $74 within our federal government. The $794 million in savings included waste where, money was being expended where it didn't need to be, but it also included other benefits that helped shape legislation and strengthen the operations of the bureaucracies to make them more efficient. For 2024, the requested budget increased to basically $860 million, with the expectation that they would continue to bring in substantial savings to our United States government. Now, the executive office, or the executive branch of our government, also has the ability to check the bureaucracy. So he does this, the president does this by several ways. One of them is he appoints the 15 cabinet heads of our departments. And by being able to pick and appoint who's going to be in charge of the bureaucratic departments, he's able to ensure that the person in charge is going to be efficient and effective and qualified for the positions. They also have their Office of Management and Budget, and the Office of Management and Budget is similar to the GAO in that they're the executive branch's agency that goes through and audits and checks the bureaucracies to look for things like excessive waste. So, what the Office of OMB, their primary job is to help the president prepare the budget that's going to be presented to Congress every year. So they're the ones that decide this is how much money we should allocate to each bureaucratic agency. Once that money's been allocated, they then go back and they audit the agencies to make sure that they were spending the money the way that it was intended to be, that there wasn't excessive waste, that they didn't have too many employees that were unnecessary within the bureaucracy itself. So they oversee the performance of the bureaucracies, and then they report back to the president. And then for the future budgets, if they find that this particular agency has excessive amounts of waste, they'll propose cutting their budget in future budgets for the years to come. Now, finally, we have an ability to check our government as well. Now, what we typically see a lot of times within the bureaucracy is that a lot of things happen behind closed doors. And we as the public don't have the ability like the GAO or the OMB to go in and audit their files because the public doesn't have general access. So what they did was Congress passed two things that would allow us to check the bureaucracy. The first one was the Freedom of Information Act of 1966. So what the Freedom of Information Act allows you and I, the average everyday citizen, is the ability to request information from the bureaucracies. So we can request information about what we call SOPs or standard operating procedures. So if we have let's say we have an application, let's say we file our taxes with the IRS. And the IRS, comes back and audits our taxes and says, hey, we think, you claimed this wrong, you did this wrong, you actually owe us more money. When we get that and we look at it, we're like, wait a minute, we don't think they follow the proper procedures because it doesn't make sense what they're saying. We have the ability to file a Freedom of Information Act to do several things. First, we can ask for their standard operating procedures. We want to know exactly what your adjudicators, what boxes they're supposed to check, what documents they're looking for, what acceptable and unacceptable documents are, so we can then see whether or not the adjudicator followed that with our particular case. We can also request a copy of our own personal files, meaning that they have to give us a copy of our tax files and the information in there. So once we get a copy of our tax files and we get a copy of the operating procedures, we can sit down and compare the two and make sure that the adjudicator didn't make a misstep or do something wrong on our application or our taxes, and make sure that everything is happening properly. It's also used by the press to find out what was happening in bureaucratic agencies, the discussions that were happening, who was at meetings where decisions were made, so that they were able to hold them accountable as well. Now, the Freedom of Information Act is free, so anyone can file one at any time to get this information. There are restrictions on the Freedom of Information Act. So if there's highly sensitive information, I do these a lot of times for my clients in immigration where we want to see, maybe they've been here for 30 years and when they came in, they were children and their parents filed something, but we don't know what it was. We'll request a copy of the file. The immigration will go through though and what we call redact or take out information that it belongs to someone else or that it's highly sensitive. So when we've done, green card applications, you have to have a sponsor who gives their taxes to show that you're not going to go on welfare, get food stamps, that sort of thing. When we do those FOIA requests, a lot of times immigration will redact or black out those tax information because they don't want us to have access to someone else's personal information. Now, 10 years later, in 1976, we saw that Congress passed the Government and Sunshine Act. So another big concern with the bureaucracy was all these meetings that were happening behind closed doors. And when things were happening behind closed doors, we, the citizens, had no way of knowing what the proper procedures were. We had no way of knowing what was being taken into consideration when contracts were being awarded or deals were being made. And so there was always this belief that, things were corrupt, that contracts were being awarded not to the most qualified or to the most competitive bidder, but maybe to someone that was related to someone in the particular bureaucracy, or someone that was giving a kickback or some sort of financial benefit to members of the bureaucracy. So the Government and Sunshine Act requires that all government bureaucratic meetings be held publicly so that we have the ability to come in and watch these meetings. It also requires them to publicly post when the meetings are going to be, where the meetings are going to be, and the agenda, what is going to be discussed at that meeting. So in advance, we, the public and the press and the media, know when they're going to talk about a particular topic so we can then attend that meeting. Now, if there's something sensitive being discussed, obviously, then they can go into a closed session and we don't have access to that. So like employment matters, discipline matters, those sorts of things generally are done privately. But by and large, most of the meetings for the bureaucracies have to be publicized in advance, and the public has to be given access to those particular meetings. All right, so let's review question number 3. I just talked about what are the 2 ways that we can check the bureaucracy. All right, so finally, we're going to talk about how the government has tried to reduce the size of the bureaucracy. The ongoing complaint has always been that the bureaucracy is too big, there's too many employees, there's too many hoops, what they call the red tape you have to jump through to get anything accomplished. So there's been a movement to try and reduce the size of the federal bureaucracy, and that has happened through what we call privatization. So privatization is meant to eliminate the inefficiencies of the bureaucracies by making it basically taking it out of the bureaucracy, taking it out of under the control of the government and having it, being outsourced. The idea here is that if it's no longer under the bureaucratic umbrella and it's being outsourced, then there's going to be competition for those particular services. And then we'll get better customer service and things will run more efficiently because now a private company or organization is running it that's trying to make a profit. So we see there's 3 types: divestiture, government contracts, and third-party financing. So if we start with divestiture, or what we also call full privatization, this occurs when government services are transferred, usually through a sale, from a government bureaucratic control into an entirely market-based private environment. So a good example of this would be our Sallie Mae student loan programs. So the federal government recognizes that students should have access to higher education, and they want to make that accessible and affordable. So they've put into place their own loan programs, the Sallie Mae loan programs. So this program is set in place for students to be able to apply for financial aid for loans to pay for their educations. So the government gives out these loans, but the government doesn't want to be in charge of making sure that payments are collected and sending out bills every month and reconciling and collections and those sorts of things. That would just increase the size of the bureaucracy, require them to hire more employees and to have more resources. So what they do is once those loans are in place, they then turn around and sell them to private loan brokers, and the private loan brokers pay the government for the loans, take them on, and then they're the ones in charge of collecting the loan payments and everything else until the loan is satisfied. So by taking it away from the federal government and giving it to a private company, now the private company has the employees and the resources to do all of that work. So unfortunately, if you have to take out loans to pay for your education, you'll find that quite frequently your loans are being resold. I took out loans for my undergraduate and my law school education. And after graduation, I would constantly receive notices saying, hey, your loan is now being serviced by this particular company or that particular company. And that was because my loan was being sold from the federal government to a private company and then among the private companies themselves. All right. Now, government contracts is another way that the government still can do its duties and its jobs without having to increase the size of the bureaucracy. So, what they do here is they take a service that they need and they hire a private company to provide them with that service. A good example of that is the GEO Group. So, the GEO Group here in California runs all of our federal detention centers, our federal prisons. So what happened is the federal government has a need for prisons. They need facilities, they need buildings, they need guards, they need, contractors to come in and provide food services. They need, there's, they need uniforms. They need all these different things for our federal prisons. So if the federal government was going to provide that, they would have to purchase the property. They would have to maintain that property. They would have to hire the employees. They would have to enter into these contracts with individuals to bring in uniforms and those sorts of things. So instead of doing that, they've contracted with the GEO Group to provide all those services for us. So the federal government pays the GEO Group, and the GEO Group is the one that is in charge of our federal detention centers and running our federal detention centers as well as our prisons. So by hiring or contracting with the GEO Group to provide us with these services, the federal government is able to keep the size of their bureaucracy smaller because these are employees they don't have to hire, and these are funds that they don't have to pay for maintenance and those sorts of things because GEO Group is handling all of that. All right. And finally, we have what we call third-party financing. So this is a complex form of privatization. Government contracts, divestitures, kind of straightforward. You can see it happening. What happens with third-party financing is sometimes there is something that the bureaucracy wants to accomplish, but it doesn't have the funds, meaning there isn't money in the budget to cover it. Congress hasn't allocated money to them, or money doesn't exist. So what the government does is it then turns around and borrows money from a third party, from a private bank, from a private lender to accomplish their goals. A good example of this is what you see here. This is military housing. So let's say Camp Pendleton needs to add more military housing and they don't have money in the military budget to create more housing. So what they'll do is they'll go to a private financing company and say, hey, we need, say, $500 million to build 100 military housing units. Can you give us that loan? And then the private lender will say, yeah, we'll loan you that money at this interest rate, at this repayment schedule. So they're able to actually get the money to accomplish what they need to with it through this private loan. The problem with third-party financing is since it is a loan as opposed to money just being allocated in the budget, there are extra costs associated with it. So it might be a $500 million project, but by the time we pay it off over 10, 20, 30 years and interest is added on to that, the federal government may have spent like, say, $100 million as opposed to the $500 million once we add in interest and everything else. The other issue with third-party financing is since we're outside the budget, when you've got the budget from the federal bureaucracies, this is how much money Congress gives you, and you're not getting any more money. So if you run out of money, you run out of money. You have to stay within your budget. But if you're doing third-party financing, you don't have to stay within your budget. If instead of a $500 million is what they need to build these housing projects, they realize they need 600, they can go back to the private lender and say, hey, kick us down another $100 million because we're going over costs. It's more expensive than we thought. And the third party financer can then say, yes, we'll give you the money, or no, we're not giving you any more money. So third party financing winds up costing our government a lot more money in the long run because there's interest associated with it. There's no cap on the budget in terms of what can be spent, but it is a way for our federal bureaucracies to be able to accomplish things that are not originally allocated for within their budgets. All right, final lecture review question. What are the 3 types of government privatization? We just talked about them.